Soldier Mage King, Chapter 21, A Remedy to Cure All Ills. Gwen frowned, setting down the tray. It wasn't the usual fare she brought up to Morgana's chambers. Instead, it was a mix of herbs, water, and honey meant to keep Morgana alive long enough for Gaius to figure out how to get her to wake. There was also a small meal there for Merlin, who had not left Morgana's side since she fell ill nearly 2 days ago. "How is she?" Gwen asked. Merlin shook her head. "No change. Will you help me sit her up so we can see about helping her keep her strength up?" Gwen nodded and helped Merlin sit Morgana up. She seemed to just be sleeping, but nothing anyone did could wake her. They managed to spoon most of the mixture of herbs, water, and honey down her throat and left her sitting up for a while to ensure she wouldn't choke. After about an hour, Gwen helped Merlin lay Morgana back down. "You look terrible," Gwen said, turning to Merlin. "Cook heard you haven't left the room since Morgana fell ill. She's sent up something special," Gwen said as Merlin sat back down on Morgana's bed. "I'm not hungry," Merlin muttered. "You have to eat, Merlin," Gwen insisted. "You haven't in days. You're not going to do Morgana any good if you fall ill as well." "Gwen's right," a voice sounded from the door, making both girls jump. Arthur closed the door behind him. Merlin looked exhausted. Dark bags had built up like bruises under her eyes. Arthur wouldn't be surprised if she hadn't gotten a moment's rest since Morgana fell ill. Gaius watched over the health of the whole castle. He could not be here all day and all night, but Merlin could. Arthur had released her from her duties until Morgana was recovered, but he'd expected her and Gaius to work in shifts. "You do look terrible, Merlin." "Gaius needs sleep more than I do," she insisted, confirming Arthur's suspicions. Arthur nodded to Gwen. "Leave us," he said gently, placing a hand on the tray to indicate it and the cool meal on it should remain behind. Gwen glanced between them and nodded, curtsying before she left. "Get over here, Merlin," Arthur ordered. Merlin glared at him for a moment before standing and tottering over to the table, not even asking before half collapsing into the chair. She stared at the food in front of her before glancing back over at Morgana. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed. Merlin began. "You need to eat, is what you need to do. You're already so skinny the wind's liable to pick you up and blow you away. Morgana will be beyond cross with me if I let one of her favorite gossips fade away for her sake," Arthur said, cutting off Merlin's protests. Pouting slightly, Merlin began to eat. Arthur remained silent, watching Morgana's face for any sign of change. When the sound of fork against plate halted, Arthur turned to order Merlin to eat again and stifled a laugh. Merlin was leaning back in the chair she'd sat down in, head tipped back slightly, fast asleep. Glancing over at Morgana to make sure she was still breathing, Arthur stood and frowned as he stepped silently over to Merlin. He should wake her, but the exhaustion in her eyes from hours of watching over Morgana had faded from her face, leaving it almost peaceful. There was still a bit of a pinched look about her face, one that spoke of exhaustion and stress, even now in her sleep. Glancing between the two girls, Arthur stepped over to the door and summoned a guard. "Have my squire Galahad gather the paperwork on my desk and bring it here. I want to spend some time with Morgana," he said, making no mention of Merlin. No one needed to know he was letting her sleep. Galahad showed up about 10 minutes later, and Arthur met him at the door, taking the paperwork and sending the squire away. He sat down opposite Merlin, who slept on, unaware. Gaius had not seen the dragon in nigh on 20 years, not since he was imprisoned and Gaius helped to spirit Valinor out of Camelot. Making his way down the dark, dank corridor carved from bare stone was nerve-wracking, but he needed advice from an outside source. Edwin was a threat to Uther, but now he also posed a more dangerous one to Merlin. He had no idea how the charlatan had discovered Merlin's powers, but he'd threatened to see her burn if Gaius uttered a word against him. He would not watch Merlin burn. He could not. But could anything be done to save Uther? "How old a man can become, and yet change so little," the dragon said, looking Gaius over. For his part, Kilgara had not changed much, though his scales had lost some of their luster. "It has been 20 years, and you have not once thought to come to me." "I do not come for myself," Gaius said, standing tall. "I know. You come about the girl. You know of Merlin." That was a bit of a surprise, though perhaps not. Being born as she was, with magic, it was likely she was something other than human, a creature of magic just like the dragon. Then there was what Gaius suspected about the identity of Merlin's father. Huneth, his youngest sister by blood, had begun to show shortly after Balinor left. She had never told him if Merlin was the daughter of the Dragon Lord or not, but he suspected there could be no other explanation. "You may struggle against her destiny, but you can no more prevent it than she can," the dragon said, and Gaius let out a breath. "And my suspicion was correct. They are the subjects of the old prophecy," Gaius breathed. "Emrys and the once and future king will stand together and unite the lands of Albion. They will free magic and bring about a new golden age," the dragon said, repeating the old prophecies Gaius knew the druids still whispered about. "She is in grave danger," Gaius said, and the dragon laughed. "No, at the moment my jailer stands in peril. Only your choice can put the girl in danger. Must Uther be sacrificed to keep her safe?" Gaius asked. He had once been Uther's friend and close confidant. Nothing had been the same since Igraine died, but every once in a while he could see his old friend somewhere behind the stone wall he had built around his heart after the loss of his wife. He did not wish to see his friend die. "Their time cannot come until his has passed." The answer was cryptic at best. "Is that time now?" "That decision falls to you for now," the dragon said, and flew up as far as the chain would allow. The conversation was clearly finished. Later, when Edwin lay dead and Uther cured by Merlin's hand, the candles sputtered low. Gaius, though, could not sleep. He stepped up the small staircase and gently eased open the door to Merlin's room. She was fast asleep in bed, one hand hanging off the frame. The book of spells he'd gifted her was barely peeking out from under the bed. Another book, this one about medicinal herbs, lay just out of reach of her fingers. He suspected she'd fallen asleep reading again. He smiled slightly, stepping up the stairs and picking up the book, placing it on the tiny table by her bed and blowing out her candle. He pulled the blanket up so she was actually covered by it. She shifted slightly in her sleep and rolled over. Gaius made his way down the stairs again and sat down on the edge of his cot. Emrys. It was a name he'd heard growing up. The prophecy of Emrys and the once and future king had been old when he was a boy. Emrys was said to be the most powerful warlock to ever live, to champion the triple goddess herself in the darkest times of magic, to be a light when all else went dark. And if the dragon was right, she was asleep mere feet away from him. He'd never felt more protective over his niece, but there was nothing that he could do to save her from this. If the goddess had chosen her to be Emrys, then that was that. The deed already done. No earthly intervention could change her fate. It was tied too closely to Arthur's. He suspected in more ways than one. But he also suspected the dragon had not been so forthcoming when speaking to Merlin. He was cryptic at best with Gaius, who had experience speaking to creatures like him, though it had been years. He sighed. He could protect her in one way. It would be better if Merlin never learned the truth of Emrys. The druids were known to worship the idea of the goddess's champion. If they learned she was real, Gaius couldn't help but wonder how that would affect Merlin, who had so long feared how her powers set her apart. She wished nothing more than to be accepted, not singled out. He sighed as he blew out his own candle. Destiny would have much in store for Merlin. Of that he was certain, if nothing else.